everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Robert Madison, trustee here at the Babcock-Smith House Museum. I have a lot of announcements to make because we hope to see you back again. Number one, the Downtown Granite Tour, and these are all on our website. The Downtown Granite Tour is on June 25th and again on August 13th. It's one of our favorites. We get a lot of people every year, so if you haven't seen downtown granite buildings with a tour guide, do come. The cemetery tour this year is going to be between the Old Town Plot and what Greg does not want us to call the Richest Stone, but some of you know the Richest Stone. So it'll be in that area, a little bit more walking maybe than some of our other tours have been, but that's going to be on July 8th and August 7th. In October, the program is going to be on James Patterson, who was the head of the New England Granite Company, given by Kathy's friend, who is a great-granddaughter of Patterson. So that's going to be very exciting. We have a couple of family tours coming up. For those of you that are at the family level, there's programs going to be for kids and adults. On the granite exhibit this summer, you'll receive an invitation. And for an upper level, there's going to be a tour of the Smith Granite Archives downstairs from the vault. So those are perks of membership, and you'll be receiving an email invitation on those. We have introduced self-guided tours at the museum. So if any of you would like to take a self-guided tour, you're welcome to do so anytime that we're open, or you can come back for a guided tour on a Thursday morning or a Saturday afternoon. So those are going to be guided tours. And we have free DVDs in the back because we're giving them away because DVDs are no longer popular. And that's on our Granite PBS program. So if you know anybody that still has a DVD, would like to see History of Granite, they're right there on the back table. Any questions or additions or whatever? Okay. Do you want me to hand these out?
Yes, please, both of them.
Before I introduce you? Or?
Yeah, I don't want you interrupting me in the middle of
I
it.
know you don't want me interrupting you. Okay, then I will do this before we begin.
One of these handouts is just a schedule that I'll try roughly to adhere to, and the other is a handout you'll need towards the very end of the program to see what was going on in Melville's mind.
So Bob is my brother, in case you don't see the family resemblance. And he is a nationally recognized Melville scholar.
Which means that a Melville scholar from another country might say, "Is that Bob Madison?" And then say, "Bob, you stole my idea last conference." And
And he is a retired teacher from the United States Naval Academy and later from the University of Arkansas, teaching English. Now he's my next door neighbor. So he has agreed. Just take however many there are. This used to happen to me when I was teaching. Can't count. Okay. And he has agreed today to talk with us about Civil War memorial poetry.
thank you very much. Back in January, I gave a lecture on this subject to a group of Civil War history scholars, and it was pretty dry. So I thought most people in Westerly would probably rather hear the poems and a little bit about them than hear a little tiny bit of a poem and then hear another 10 minutes of explanation of why it was written. So I'm going to actually work with several poets who led up to Melville, and I'll be reading several complete poems and several excerpts from poems as we go along, but the emphasis will be on the reading. And if you have a question, just shout it out now. I hate it when everybody says save your questions to the end because then you forget your question. And so I think we can do that. And I'd rather run this the same way I would run a poetry class, except I'd be sitting all the time in poetry class. So I actually brought my stool here so I won't have to stand up for the entire class. The situation of poetry, especially war poetry, at the middle of the 19th century was complex, especially being in America. We had a lot of poetic activity, purely patriotic in nature, surrounding and following the War of the Revolution and the War of 1812. And most of that evaporated. During the Mexican War, there was a lot of topical poetry written, but none of it really has lasted as real poetry or as poetry that people appreciate. The English had a different problem. Their big war at mid-century was in the Crimea, and none of the poets went to war. You're all familiar with the poets of World War I, who all died in the trenches or shortly thereafter in World War I. But in the situation in 1854, the news came slowly and sporadically from halfway around the world, and the poets could only read lines in a newspaper and try to imagine what really was going on. They didn't even have, they had at some point the London Illustrated News started illustrating news reports, and Harper's did that in the United States. But for the most part, they were just reading verbal accounts, and it's hard to work with that. On the other hand, if you are the poet laureate who has managed to reincarnate Arthur and his round table, then you probably have enough imagination to write a good poem. And the most famous poem to come out of the Crimean conflict is one that you've all heard. There's several different versions of this poem published at different times. And this is the one that was collected in the first book that Tennyson did after the Crimean War began. And it's a long poem called Maud, and I've never read it. But he knew what was popular, so the very last poem in this book is The Charge of the Light Brigade. I bet you all of you in this room can recite some of it, but I won't make you. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Charge was the captain's cry, theirs not to reason why, theirs not to make reply, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. And you all know how it goes from there. But that's what any poet endeavoring to begin writing about the Civil War had to deal with, because this was the most famous living poet in the English language, and he had written what remains probably the most famous war poem of the 19th century in English. He wasn't the only one writing. This tiny little book, which is the rarest of all the books that's here actually, was written by the author of a book which gave its name to a famous cookie. Any guesses? Love story set in Exmoor, Lorna Doone. But Melville, for instance, didn't read Lorna Doone until 50 years later. So we have something unusual going on here. This little book is called The Bugle of the Black Sea. And when Richard Doddridge Blackmore was 20 years old, he was just beginning to set up a garden, marketing garden business to supply Covent Garden with fresh vegetables and rare varieties of fruit. And he was very upset by the war, and he was trained in literature, and he started to write some poems. And he says in this, the very first thing you read is the writer begs to acknowledge his obligations to the vivid narratives of the Times correspondent. Well, yes. But I picked this up and wanted to read it because one of the things that's happening in the middle of the century is we're transitioning from the sound of horses and guns in a battle to other more mechanical sounds. What need to tell the tramp and clank, the guns that stop the way, the crowded wharf, the broken rank, the hurry and delay. And I suppose that was accurate. Blackmore had no way of knowing. But what he's probably listening to are the 4 o'clock in the morning horses and wagons and chains and everything bringing produce into the market in London. In the United States, we had a famous war poem. It was read on the anniversary of the fight in Concord during the American Revolution. What's the famous line? And fired the shot heard round the world. And it was Emerson. But they dedicated a monument, but when Emerson's poem was presented, it was sung. I don't think he actually read it. And the tune that they used was Old Hundred. So even though this hymn arrives to us as a poem, and I'll read it 2 different ways, or read the beginning 2 different ways. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. And that sounds like a good poem, doesn't it? I mean, it's catchy. Emerson knew what he was doing. But it was sung to the doxology. And so if you were going to read it the same way it was sung, it would sound quite different. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. And you can even sing that to yourself. Da 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 dum. Da 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 dum. Da 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 dum. I can't read it that way, so I'm just going to have to read the rest to you as a poet. The foe long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror silent sleeps, and time the ruined bridge has swept down the dark stream which seaward creeps. On this green bank, by this soft stream, we set today a votive stone, that memory may their deed redeem, when like our sires, our sons are gone. Spirit that made those heroes dare to die or leave their children free, bid time and nature gently spare the shaft we raise to them and thee. And that was America's probably most famous war poem up until the advent of the Civil War. Melville read that. He got a copy of Emerson's poems in 1859, right at the beginning of the war. He didn't pay any attention to it. He was working on a book of poetry at that time based on scenes in Italy, a trip to the Holy Land, very British-sounding topics, and wasn't interested in war poetry at all. And yet, all of a sudden, the country is thrown into turmoil. I've skipped Sidney Dobell's poem here because it deserves to be read at a lectern. Sidney Dobell was the precursor of the World War I poets, and I'll think you'll be able to hear the difference in subject matter, in tone, in poetic construction. This is a straight-up sonnet, no ballad meter here, no catchy phrases or tunes. And this poem, as was typical for the British, was not about what's happening in the Crimea, but what's happening at home. And the title of it is Home.
Can you tell us who
Sidney Dobell was, you've got his dates there. He was part of a movement called the Spasmodics, and it was a name that was applied in ridicule. But actually, it was very important because I think the majority of poets today who are interested in expressing feeling are more in the tradition of Sidney Dobell than they would be in, say, a Tennyson, who was interested in having you imagine these great pictures of medieval pageantry and so forth. So it's a difference of whether your poem is to represent the way you feel about something inside, or regardless of how you feel, to represent some picture that you're looking at outside. And yet, Sidney will draw a picture for us. She turned the fair page with her fairer hand, more fair and frail than it was wont to be. O'er each remembered thing he loved to see, she lingered, and as with a fairy's wand enchanted it to order. Oft she fanned the new motes into the sun, and as a bee sings through a break of bells, so murmured she, and so her patient love did understand the reliquary room. Upon the sill she fed his favorite bird. Ah, robin, sing, he loves thee. Then she touches a sweet string of soft recall, and towards the eastern hills smiles all her soul. For him who cannot hear the raven croaking at his carrion ear. So a couple of feelings then, and Dobell plunges us into rank sentimentality and then sticks us with that. We would call it today a post-Vietnam interpretation of war because it emphasizes the horror of it. The next group of poets is going to be poets who wrote during the war itself. And their expression is not the one that's lasted as an encapsulation of the war. So as you hear these, if they are a little rough or a little too focused or a little too topical, remember that these are the first pieces of literature to come out of the war. And if we think back to the war that meant to people of our age, the Vietnam War, we didn't really see high art. In our age, it would be movies. We didn't see the great Vietnam War movies arising until about 10 years after that. I think that great flurry of World War II movies really had to wait pretty much till the early 50s. So after the war, there's this emergence of the horror of that war until it can arise later in some form of art. The greatest Civil War novel wasn't written until 30 years after the war, The Red Badge of Courage. So the first one of these, ironically, a very famous war poem, was written by a Quaker from Northeast Massachusetts, John Greenleaf Whittier, someone who would later be called one of the schoolroom poets. And so if you had Miss Kingsley for English, you are familiar with these people. Barbara Fritchie was a woman, and she is historical, but once you've said she's historical, the details of all this really are not certain. The Confederate soldier involved in this poem may or may not have been Thomas Jonathan Jackson, and she may or may not have flown a flag in front of her house. And the conversations, of course, are probably all made up, the stuff of legends. But John Greenleaf Whittier specialized in legendary poetry. Up from the meadows rich with corn, clear in the cool September morn, the clustered spires of Frederick stand, green-walled by the hills of Maryland. Round about them orchards sweep, apple and peach tree fruited deep, fair as a garden of the Lord to the eyes of the famished rebel horde. On that pleasant morn of the early fall, when Lee marched over the mountain wall, over the mountains winding down, horse and foot into Frederick town. 40 flags with their silver stars, 40 flags with their crimson bars, flapped in the morning wind. The sun of noon looked down and saw not one. Up rose old Barbara Fritchie then, bowed with her 80 years and 10. Bravest of all in Frederick town, she took up the flag the men hauled down. In her attic window the staff she set to show that one heart was loyal yet. Up the street came the rebel tread, Stonewall Jackson riding ahead. Under his slouched hat, left and right, he glanced. The old flag met his sight. Halt! The dust-brown ranks stood fast. Fire! Out blazed the rifle blast. It shivered the window pane and sash. It rent the banner with seam and gash. Quick as it fell from the broken staff, Dame Barbara snatched the silken scarf. She leaned far out on the window-sill and shook it forth with a royal will. Shoot if you must this old gray head, but spare your country's flag, she said. A shade of sadness, a blush of shame, over the face of the leader came. The nobler nature within him stirred to life at that woman's deed and word. Who touches a hair of yon gray head dies like a dog. March on, he said. All day long through Frederick Street sounded the tread of marching feet. All day long that free flag tossed over the heads of the rebel host. Ever its torn folds rose and fell on the loyal winds that loved it well, and through the hill gap's sunset light shone over it with a warm good night. Barbara Fritchie's work is o'er, and the rebel rides on his rage no more. Honor to her, and let a tear fall for her sake on Stonewall's bier. Over Barbara Fritchie's grave, flag of freedom and union wave. Peace and order and beauty draw round thy symbol of light and law. And ever the stars above look down on thy stars below in Fredericktown. Barbara Fritchie. It's not bad stuff. It's not bad stuff at all. I wish I had written that. There was a real Barbara Fritchie. Whether she said any of that, whether it was Jackson, history dismantles most of that stuff. So that was early. That was 1862. And the other big event from Melville's point of view in 1862 was the fight between the Monitor and the Merrimack in Hampton Roads. And that is celebrated, if I can find the right book. I don't find the right book, which means it must be in this one. Not everything has an individual book. Just to skip ahead a little bit, this is an anthology of war poetry who came out after the end of the war, and it includes nearly everything that's good, but not quite all, as we'll see in a minute. The Cumberland by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Now I have one down here as by our friend Boker, and he was important, but his Cumberland poem isn't as good as Longfellow's, so I'm going to read Longfellow's. At anchor in Hampton Roads we lay on board the Cumberland, sloop of war, and at times from the fortress across the bay the alarm of drums swept past, or a bugle blast from the camp on shore. Then far away to the south uprose a little feather of snow-white smoke, and we knew that the iron ship of our foes was steadily steering its course to try the force of our ribs of oak. Down upon us heavily runs, silent and sullen, the floating fort. Then comes a puff of smoke from her guns, and leaps the terrible death with fiery breath from each open port. We are not idle, but send her straight defiance back in a full broadside. As hail rebounds from a roof of slate, rebounds our heavier hail from each iron scale of the monster's hide. And it goes on for several pages. Of the next poem in the book is Boker's, and I'll read you how that begins. Stand to your guns, men, Morris cried. Small need to pass the word. Our men at quarters ranged themselves before the drum was heard. And then began the sailors' jests, What thing is that, I say? A longshore meeting house adrift is standing by the bay. Now, you can hear the difference. The second one is a regular ballad meter. Longfellow's is a little more embellished metrically. But I think the main difference is that Melville, that Longfellow's poem conveys a sense of knowing how important this day is and what's going on. And Boker does a very good job of narratively focusing on and telling you what's actually happening on the vessel, which is typical, I think, of both of those poets. Boker isn't read today at all. Longfellow, of course, was one of the schoolroom poets, and so was read continuously for 150 years until our teachers died. And then I don't know if outside of talking about Melville's poetry, I don't think I've taught Longfellow either. I did give a report once in college to one of your husband's colleagues, Eric Schoonover, on Hiawatha, and I was talking about the meter of it. You all know Hiawatha, by the shores of Gitche Gumee, by the shining Big Sea Water. And Professor Schoonover came back and told me that all weekend long he hadn't been able to sleep because that rhythm was going through his brain. But I think Longfellow is a great poet. There's a poem that didn't make it into the anthology, and it was Charles G. Halpin's poem, Sambo's Right to be Kilt. And I'm a little uncertain how to do this because the N-word appears in it. But the speaker is an Irishman, so you can't even tell that it's that word. On the other hand, I can't do an Irish accent. Does anybody here specialize in Irish literature? Well, just pretend that this is an Irishman speaking, an Irish immigrant to America who has, in order to make any kind of a living, has had to sign up for war. So this is called Sambo's Right to be Kilt, and the speaker's name is Miles O'Reilly. O'Reilly for the Irish, and Miles because it means soldier in Latin. Some tell us 'tis a burnin' shame to make the nagers fight, and that the thrade of being kilt belongs but to the white. But as for me, upon me soul, so liberal are we, I'll let Sambo be murdered instead of myself on every day of the year. On every day in the year, boys, and in every hour of the day. The right to be kilt I'll divide with him, and divil a word I'll say. In battle's wiles commotion, I shouldn't at all object if Sambo's body should stop a ball that was coming for me direct. By the prod of a southern bagnet, so generous are we here, I'll resign and let Sambo take it on every day of the year. On every day of the year, boys, and with none of your nasty pride. All my right in a southern bagnet prod with Sambo I'll divide. The men who object to Sambo should take his place and fight, and it's better to have a nager's hue than a liver that's wake and white. Though Sambo's black as the ace of spades, his finger a trigger can pull, and his eye runs straight on the barrel sights from under his thatch of wool. So hear me all, boys darlin', don't think I'm tipping you chaff. The right to be kilt will divide with him and give him the largest half. Well, it's a political poem, isn't it? It's not just what we haven't seen this so far, but beginning with some of these minor poets, there are serious political issues that are going to come out of this. Primarily, response to those in the North who support Southern independence, and then in the case of the draft riots, against the draft entirely, and in this particular case, against the arming of black soldiers to fight in the war. Because the South also had an impetus towards arming the black soldiers, which didn't make any sense at all. And the vice presidents of the Confederacy stood against it, Alexander Stephens, and he acknowledged that if we arm black soldiers, it undermines everything we have ever said about race. No comment about the current political application of such a discussion. Can anybody name the Secretary of the Navy? The previous chief of naval operations before she was removed this spring was a student of mine from Northwestern. I'm so proud of her. Lisa Franchetti, Admiral Lisa Franchetti. And she read some of the stuff at Northwestern. She took an independent study on literature of the sea. In those days, of course, if you're going to plan for a career in the military, you actually learn something about it.
So can we tell the audience what you're referring to?
Well, she was fired because she's a woman, and she's the chief of naval operations.
Well, and many of you may have read Heather Cox-Richardson this morning, who talked about the current Secretary of the Navy who went to Hawaii and in April announced that he had gone to Hawaii to visit Pearl Harbor, the day of infamy, remember, on June 7th. June 7th.
He wasn't one of my students. He was not. Okay. The black regiments were in the field by 1863, and you've all seen the movie Glory and so forth, and you know that story. By late 1863, the Union was holding its own against the Southern defenses, and was actually taking the war more into Virginia than it had successfully done. But the place that it was most successful, and where also the bloodiest battles were was the Shenandoah Valley. If you like Rhode Island history, the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry was stationed in the Shenandoah Valley, and one day they were just obliterated in Middleburg. They were ambushed and probably lost half their people. I don't know how many horses. I mean, there was cavalry. So, and if you read the enlistments in that regiment, you read the names of people that you grew up with in Westerly. It was their great-grandparents. This is Sheridan's ride. So Sheridan went from Cedar Creek north to the town of Winchester, which stands at the very foot of the valley. In the Shenandoah Valley, the head is south and the foot is north because that's the way the river runs. So he was doing business in Winchester when the Confederates attacked his camp by surprise. And everybody was getting ready for breakfast, and the Confederate troops came in and just waved right across the camp. And you couldn't, there was nothing to be done. It was just a stampede, a panic. And their commanding officer was 20 miles away in Winchester. Thomas Buchanan Reed was a poet of some stature before the war, but I think his best poetry turned out to be what he wrote, and this is probably his best poem. Up from the south at break of day, bringing to Winchester fresh dismay, the affrighted air with a shudder bore, like a herald in haste to the chieftain's door, the terrible grumble and rumble of war, telling the battle was on once more, and Sheridan was 20 miles away. And wider still those billows of war thundered along the horizon's bar, and louder yet into Winchester rolled the war of that Red Sea uncontrolled, making the blood of the listener cold as he thought of the stake in that fiery fray, and Sheridan 20 miles away. But there's a road from Winchester town, a good broad highway leading down, and there, through the flush of the morning light, a steed as black as the steeds of night was seen to pass as with eagle flight, as if he knew the terrible need. He stretched away with his utmost speed. Hills rose and fell, but his heart was gay, with Sheridan 15 miles away. Still sprung from those swift hoofs thundering south, the dust like the smoke from the cannon's mouth, or the trail of a comet sweeping faster and faster, foreboding to traders the doom of disaster. The heart of the steed and the heart of the master were beating like prisoners assaulting their walls, impatient to be where the battlefield calls. Every nerve of the charger was strained to full play, with Sheridan only 10 miles away. Under his spurning feet the road like an arrowy alpine river flowed, and the landscape sped and away behind like an ocean flying before the wind, and the steel like a bark fed with furnace ire swept on with his wild eyes full of fire. But lo, he is nearing his heart's desire, he's snuffing the smoke of the roaring fray, with Sheridan only 5 miles away. The first that the general saw were the groups of stragglers and then the retreating troops. What was done, what to do, a glance told him both. Then striking his spurs with a terrible oath, he dashed down the line mid a storm of huzzas, and the wave of retreat checked its course there because the sight of the master compelled it to pause. With foam and with dust, the black charger was gray. By the flash of his eye and his red nostrils' play, he seemed to the whole great army to say, I have brought you Sheridan all the way, from Winchester down to save the day. Hurrah, hurrah for Sheridan! Hurrah, hurrah for horse and man! And when their statues are placed on high, under the dome of the Union sky, the American soldier's temple of fame, there with the glorious general's name, be it said in letters bold and bright, here is the steed that saved the day by carrying Sheridan into the fray from Winchester, 20 miles away. Who does it sound like? Who had Mr. Pray for English? It's Browning. Straight up Browning. And that's where he got his sense of writing poetry. But it's good. It's good. And I think that's, just to think about it over everything you'll hear today, I think that poem probably captures best my image of what was going on in that war, the combination of patriotism and heroics and so forth. But of course, that's the old-fashioned way of looking at it. And by the time we get to Melville, things will change. When we first talked about this talk, I wanted to get some local poets in, and I was reminded that Julia Ward Howe had a connection to Westerly, and it's a tenuous one, I'm sorry. But she did write a very famous poem. It would be a candidate for the most famous poem to come out of the war. But there's nothing in the Battle Hymn of the Republic that's really about out in the dust. And she did that deliberately because what people were doing, they were singing the John Brown song, and she thought that tune was too good a marching song to be linked with silly John Brown lyrics. And so she wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which I'm not going to read or sing to you. But I am going to move on to the other Rhode Island poet, Henry Howard Brownell. And I have a couple of his books here. His most famous poem was called The Bay Fight. So the Bay Fight, as he dates this, is August 5th, 1864. So we're getting close to ending this war. But we're still writing during the war. And the Bay Fight was Farragut. And Farragut is the guy who said, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. In Farragut's day, a torpedo was a big barrel full of gunpowder with pokey, not fuses, but caps, things that if something percussed against them, it would light a trail of mercury, a fulminate of mercury, and it would blow up the bomb right next to the ship. But they weren't torpedoes in the sense of, like you see in all the World War II movies. They were just sitting there. And you couldn't see them because they were sunk mostly beneath the water. And so if the ships slowed down to avoid the torpedoes, then the artillery on shore could take them out. And that's why Farragut said to him, the torpedoes full speed ahead. He realized that maybe one or two vessels would hit the torpedoes, but the fleet would get through and win the battle, which is fairly cold-blooded. But by 1864, generals had to think in cold blood because nobody was winning the war. Brownell was a cousin by marriage of Herman Melville through the Bristol family of the de Wolfs, which is an interesting sidelight in itself. So Melville would not have missed a relative's book of poetry when it came out. There was an earlier book than this. I think this is Brownell's first book of war poetry, but the war hadn't gotten here yet. And I'm not going to try to read this because it is a longer narrative poem, more in the nature of Sir Walter Scott, and I'll come back to that in just a second. 3 days through sapphire seas we sailed, the steady trade blew strong and free, the northern light his banners paled, the ocean stream our channels wet. We rounded low Canaveral's lee and passed the isles of emerald set in blue Bahamas' turquoise sea. Now, everything in that is perfectly mundane. Anyone in this room could have written that because he wasn't there, because he's starting this poem writing about what he's read in a newspaper. So I'm flipping pages here. This is all the same poem, and I want to get to the end because, of course, they win the battle. They do avoid most of the torpedoes. Today the Dahlgren and the drum are dread apostles of his name. His kingdom here can only come by chrism of blood and flame. Be strong, already slants the gold athwart these wild and stormy skies. Nothing, just generalized war description and hagiography. But you know who liked it? The admiral. So Admiral Farragut took this guy, made him his personal adjutant, or whatever they would call it at sea, and he was with Farragut through the rest of the campaigns of the Civil War, wrote several more poems, which are actually a lot better than that particular one. But that was the poem that he wrote, published it, and Farragut said, "Who is this guy? I want him on my ship." Sounds like Trump. But Trump never got anything as positive as that written for him. So, wow. Okay, so 1865 comes around, and the end of the war looks like it's in sight. And so some of these guys had published their books in 64 when things just turned around and began to look optimistic. But now, as the war came to a close, there were other people who thought about seriously entering this poetic fray and becoming the poet of the war. Boker and Brownell were the poets of the war. Whittier could never be the poet of the war because he was a Quaker. He couldn't really celebrate that kind of activity. But at this time, as the war drew to a close, the most famous war poet, and I'm not even going to read you any of his work because you know him too well, Walt Whitman, decided he had been doing some scribbling of war pieces and they were okay. And so he decided to put them into a book called Drum Taps. And it was ready for publication in early April of 1865. Sic semper tyrannis. And Whitman doesn't have any Lincoln material, and the Lincoln has just been shot. So he immediately pulls everything out, starts writing these poems about President Lincoln, And so a couple of weeks later, the second issue of Drum Taps comes out, and this time the title page says, Drum Taps and Memories of President Lincoln. And that's where "Oh Captain, My Captain" comes from. And that's when Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed comes from. And on the basis of that, which must have been scribbled incredibly fast, he must have written those incredibly fast, then he becomes the great poet of the Civil War, and deservedly so, because he's doing a lot of things with poetry too that are different. As you all know, "Oh Captain, My Captain" is a very formal, typical poem with rhyme and everything else. But When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed is not. That's more Whitman's style and way of writing, and is a brilliant piece. Of course, it takes place at home, and that puts him again in the wake of Sidney Dobell and those home poems. Whitman obviously had seen the war. He was a nurse in Washington, D.C. Late in the war, also, Herman Melville went to see the war itself, and it resulted in a long poem, far too long to write about here. It was I'll read you the actual title here because I don't want to screw it up. It's not idiomatic. It's called A Scout Toward Aldie. And Aldie was in the Shenandoah Valley. And a scout was when a cavalry troop would just go out on a reconnaissance, the same kind of thing that the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry did when they were wiped out. But this is a poem about Mosby, about guerrilla warfare in Northern Virginia. And it does successfully capture the horror of guerrilla warfare at the same time that it treats Mosby as basically a Scottish chieftain and a hero among his people. But now we're at Melville. I'm going to read you a couple of Melville poems here in the order that he put them in his book. But we don't have any evidence that he actually wrote any of these at the time of the incidents. Instead, before Melville wrote anything, he would get a book out of the library or buy a book about it, so he had all the information he needed. And in this case, during the war, there was a series of big fat volumes called the Rebellion Record, and they published official reports. They published maps and diagrams and things like that. They published poetry, they published songs, anything that had to do with the war. And the time lapse here was a year or two behind the events, because the editor, Frank Moore, had to take that time to put these things all together and then do them in volumes. But Melville had most of these volumes in 1865 when he decided he was going to write. This one is called The Portent, and I think you'll hear a difference in the poetry. Look for or listen for the imagery in this poem, the pictures that you're asked to imagine compared to some of the other pictures that you've been asked to imagine by the poets. Hanging from the beam, slowly swaying, such the law, gaunt the shadow on your green Shenandoah. The cut is on the crown, lo, John Brown, and the stabs shall heal no more. Hidden in the cap is the anguish none can draw, so your future veils its face, Shenandoah. But the streaming beard is shown, weird John Brown, the meteor of the war. I think that's pretty good stuff. He's still using rhyme. Melville was not big on free verse. The next poem is of an early engagement in the war. This is the one that you have the handout for, which shows the picture of the movement of the fleet. Now, this is the picture that Melville saw in the book in front of him, which inspired him to write a perfectly regular poem about a perfectly regular military execution, and to use that as his controlling image through the poem. In time and measure perfect moves all art whose aim is sure, Evolving rhyme and stars divine have rules, and they endure. Nor less the fleet that warred for right, and warring so prevailed, in geometric beauty curved, and in an orbit sailed. The rebel at Port Royal felt the unity or awe, and rued the spell, a type was here, and victory of law. I think that's a pretty amazing piece of writing, especially from the guy whose most famous character was out of his mind and launched off in huge, different, uncontrolled spasms of imagery from the quarterdeck of the Pequod.
What's the Toad by Isaac Smith reference?
Well, the Isaac Smith was one of the steamers, I believe, that was taken into government service at the time. But you'd have to ask Dwight Brown if that's one of our Isaac Smiths.
Linda says no.
He never had a ship named after him built in Avondale or down the street.
Too bad. That would have been a nice connection.
This is the most important poem to come out of the Civil War in English. It's important because it shifts away from the Sir Walter Scott writing that typified, for instance, Sheridan's Ride. Sheridan's Ride is a very lively piece, but it sounds more like Young Lochinvar than it does anything that we associate with war today. So this is Melville's rejection of the romanticism of war, a utilitarian view of the monitor's fight. And you don't need to know this, but utilitarianism was one of the hugely popular philosophies during the Victorian Age, and its main proponent was Jeremy Bentham, who left his skeleton to science. So you can go see it if you want to see it somewhere today. In London. I think it's in London. Utilitarianism is something that Charles Dickens hated because it was the greatest good for the greatest number. And if you take that coldly, in a cold extreme, it means that you do not regard the anguish of children, the poverty of people who can't work. It doesn't have to be that way, obviously, but that was one way that was the way Dickens viewed it. In this, Melville artificially is taking a utilitarian view of naval combat. Plain be the verse, yet apt the Plain be the phrase, yet apt the verse, more ponderous than nimble. For since grimed war here laid aside his orient pomp, 'twould ill befit or much to ply the rhyme's barbaric symbol. Hail to the victory without the God of glory, zeal that needs no fans of banners, plain mechanic power, plied cogently in war now placed where war belongs, among the trades and artisans. Yes, this was battle and intense, beyond the strife of fleets heroic, deadlier, closer, calm mid-storm, no passion, all went on by crank, pivot, and screw, and calculations of caloric. Needless to dwell, the story's known, the ringing of those plates on plates still ringeth round the world. The clangor of that blacksmith's fray, the anvil din, resounds the message from the fates. War shall yet be, and to the end, but war paint shows the streaks of weather. War yet shall be, but warriors are now but operatives. War's made less grand than peace, and a singe runs through lace and feather. So you're not going to see much romanticism in poetry of war after that point in literature. Now, that didn't occur in 1862 when the battle took place. It occurred in 1865 or 66. I need to find that date exactly for you because it makes a difference. So it's 1866. And that's actually prescient for 1866 because most people were not looking forward, as Melville and Whitman were, to what was happening next. Melville did have a fond spot, however, for pastoral literature. He loved Wordsworth. And he was not present at the Battle of Shiloh, but he did write a very famous poem about the battle, one that Shelby Foote read in Rick Burns's PBS series on the Civil War. And Shelby Foote liked it so much that he wrote a whole novel about the Battle of Shiloh. As you listen to this, think forward to a World War I poem that borrows much of the same imagery. Skimming lightly, wheeling still, the swallows fly low over the field in clouded days, the forest field of Shiloh. Over the field where April rain solaced the parched one stretched in pain, through the pause of night that followed the Sunday fight around the church of Shiloh. The church so lone, the log-built one, that echoed to many a parting groan and natural prayer of dying foemen mingled there. Foemen at morn, but friends at eve, fame or country least their care. What like a bullet can undeceive? But now they lie low, while over them the swallows skim, and all is hushed at Shiloh. That's a good place to end. Do you think McCrae ever read that? I don't know. Melville had great fame from 4 of his first 5 novels. And then he totally lost his public by going either philosophical, as in Moby Dick, or touching subjects that nobody could touch in Pierre. And basically his career as a novelist ended in 1857 with a book called The Confidence Man, which is pretty good, but it's a book about the Mississippi River. And who reads a book about the Mississippi River in American literature? So, yes. So it's forgotten before, a forgotten work before Twain. None of these Civil War books sold well. I'm not sure. The man who put together the anthology in, let's see the exact date of this, 1866 as well. So he got that anthology out in 1866. And to do him justice, it includes most of the good stuff. There's not a single Whitman poem, and there's not a single Melville poem. So if he'd waited 1 year longer, maybe he would have recognized that poetry had changed and included some of that stuff. But I don't think any of this poetry really enhanced the reputation of the people who wrote it. Grant White himself was America's foremost Shakespeare scholar at the time that he did this book. Because he was highly regarded in literature, he was sort of like the Harold Bloom of his day, or of earlier days, Eliot as a reputation maker, or perhaps there was somebody in between. But mainly his business was Shakespeare, and it was academic. He wasn't into this popular poetry stuff. The reputations were not made. The poetry immediately fell into a chasm. The only work that kept being read was Whitman, and that's because Whitman revised all of Leaves of Grass every couple of years until he died, and you kept seeing these new versions of it, which included this work by then, until he finally broke through and made his reputation. Whitman had a steady but small reputation. He was never as famous as Longfellow or any of those people were. But his fame grew and his influence was great. Late in the century, Edith Wharton wrote a short story where a man, Civil War veteran, these people are older now, and they notice a book on the book's open. It's got a picture of Whitman in it, and one of the men says, "Who's that?" And the other guy says, "Well, that's Walt Whitman." And the first guy says, "Yeah, I remember him. He was a nurse in D.C. when I was in the hospital. He did all these wonderful things for the men, kept up the morale, saved their lives, and so forth and so on." He says, yeah, that's the guy. And he wrote this book. Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. What a life he led. How unfortunate that he wrote all this twaddle. But that's the Edith Wharton. That's a summary of the Edith Wharton story. So she recognized that Whitman's character was even greater than his poetry. And in an age when there were probably, you could count on one hand your neighbors who had heard of Walt Whitman, and but he was it. So why didn't the war poetry elevate Whitman? Why did all the rest of the war poets fall into oblivion? And I think the answer was what we would call today post-traumatic stress disorder. People didn't want it. People didn't want to be reminded of that. No matter how romantic a poem is, I think people in the wake of the Civil War were reluctant to take that as a substitute for their husbands and sons who had gone off to war and died. It just didn't work. Now, you do see the same kind of thing working even today, where the glorification is supposed to be a substitute for the sacrifice and loss that takes place, and some people buy into that. But I don't think the American public did then. 1866, the most famous poem of the immediate post-war years, was not about war at all. It was about a family shut in by snow in northeastern Massachusetts. Same guy that wrote Barbara Fritchie. The sun that brief December day rose cheerless over hills of gray, and darkly circled gave at noon a sadder light than waning moon, slow tracing down the thickening sky, its mute and ominous prophecy, a portent seeming less than threat. It sank from sight before it set. A chill no coat, however stout, of homespun stuff could quite shut out, a hard, dull bitterness of cold that checked mid-vein the circling race of lifeblood in the sharpened face. The coming of the snowstorm told. The wind blew east, we heard the roar of ocean on his wintry shore, and felt the strong pulse throbbing there, beat with low rhythm our inland air. And of course it goes on to describe how the people amused themselves during the storm. And that's what people wanted to read, and that also became the great New England poem. When I took Earth Science in 1970, 71, the final exam was you had to describe in technical terms the weather of that poem. Don't you love cross-disciplinary science? So that's what people wanted to read. Literature itself changed. For about 25 years, the romantic novel in the tradition of Sir Walter Scott and James Fenimore Cooper, that kind of stuff was dead flat. When the first great Civil War novel came out, The Red Badge of Courage, it was written originally as a dismal, pessimistic piece in which Henry Fleming, the young hero, learned nothing from his war experience, and that this romanticism was an illusion. And the manuscript was so pessimistic that Hitchcock, the editor, I think it was Scribner's who publishes it, the editor forced Stephen Crane to change the ending or he wouldn't publish the novel. And Crane, a young novelist who needed to get published, changed it. And ironically, in retrospect, now everybody reads that book of, oh look, the war made Henry Fleming what he is today. It gave him this, didn't do any of that. So it was only after the Vietnam War that scholars went back and tried to retrieve the original version of that story and find out that Henry Fleming just was destroyed by the war. He wasn't made a man by it. And that's where we're going to end up. And I thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
I think don't just get up and leave, because you can come up here and you can put your hands on books, not the actual copies, but the same editions that Melville looked at when he was writing poetry, or that anybody would look at. So come here and